Hello, Peter Wheelhauer here from Western Michigan University. These lectures are a series of lectures that are going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important documents in U.S. history, but also in world history in terms of expressing the relationship between citizens and their government, and what the founding fathers of our country thought that ought to look like. But it's obviously been a controversial document because there seem to be some areas that are kind of ambiguous. So we're going to look at some of those areas, particularly the relationship between the statements that all men are created equal and what that means for gender equality as well as racial equality. There are 3 lectures in this series. Here's the first one. The reason we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, we're going to start it today, we're going to end it up on next Tuesday, is that this is really one of the single most important documents in United States political history, and it's also considered to be one of the most important political documents in world history. So I think it's worth sitting down, and even though it seems kind of familiar to us in a general way, I really want to work through its most important parts in some detail, because I think it's critical for you to understand this in terms of understanding the minds of the authors of the Constitution and to understand why they made some of the decisions that they did and what their hopes and expectations were for the United States. The Declaration basically makes 3 kinds of arguments. The first argument it makes is that they believed in divine law and natural law. The authors did. And so what they did was they said that there's a pretty unanimous argument, pretty unanimous belief that the King of England had violated these laws, whether you define them in terms of religion or define them in terms of nature, that there are these higher laws and that the king had violated them. And because he'd been destructive of the things that he was supposed to be protecting, he had become a tyrant and no longer worthy of being a ruler over these people. The Declaration makes 3 different kinds of arguments about why this is the case. It makes a philosophical argument, and this philosophical argument has both secular and religious roots to it. It makes specifically religious arguments, and then it makes particularly legal arguments that worked out of the understanding about how constitutions work and what the right relationship is constitutionally between the British government and the British citizens. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up by noting that the Declaration of Independence is written in the form, given the documents that we know of that founding era, it's written in the form of a social compact. That is, an agreement between the people of the time about what their culture, what their society was going to look like. One of the things that we do not see in the Declaration is anything about what the structure of government should be. That was considered to be a completely separate issue. This was designed to be a set of ideas that would underlie any political structure that generation would then decide to create. Now, the Declaration itself was written not by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft. Thomas Jefferson was part of a committee of men at the Continental Congress who wrote the document. So Jefferson wrote the first draft, and just like any first draft, what do you do with subsequent drafts? You revise it. You make changes, additions, and subtractions. That turns out to be very important. We also have on the same committee John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. You might have heard of John Adams. He had a famous brother, Sam. There are 4 basic parts to the Declaration itself. The Preamble, which we're all mostly familiar with. The philosophical justification, which a lot of us are familiar with. The list of grievances, which is usually the part we skip over because it looks too long and boring. And the conclusions. We're going to spend most of our time looking at the Preamble and the philosophical justification. Because again, I want you to understand why these men at this moment in history said these things. And then we can evaluate whether or not they were saying things that are really universal and eternal or just temporary for the moment. Bless you. So we're going to work our way through the text. Now, as I work through most of these notes, on the left-hand side is the actual text of the Declaration of Independence, written in script that probably looks really hard to read from way in the back of the room, so I'll probably change that script in the future. But you don't have to write this part down because this is all just, it's the Declaration. It's in the back of your book. You can read that yourself. What I'm going to write here on the right-hand side are my notes about these different pieces and the statements that they're making. Okay? So this is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This is the preamble. It's the very beginning. It says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to declare the causes that justify our decision to rebel against England. Now you've got to understand the big picture here. The big picture here is that every man who signed this was a traitor. Every single one of them. If this whole project failed, this whole independence project failed, every one of them would be hung, their possessions sold, their families sold into servitude. They would lose everything because they're traitors against the King of England. So the words that they use in this document are incredibly important because they provide an overarching and, if needed, a legal justification for committing treason. That's a pretty high bar. But it's important for us to understand what's going on in their heads if this thing goes sideways on them. It matters. So what do we see first? Well, first, this paragraph communicates unanimity. It's the unanimous declaration of 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people. The argument that they're making here, it's an underlying subtle thing, is that we are all together. The reality is they weren't. The best idea that we have is that about 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans, British colonists living in America, were behind the revolution, but perhaps a full third were opposed to breaking from England. So they were not unanimous. Even in the vote for this document, yeah, it's unanimous, but it's not unanimous completely because there were some people who abstained from the vote. They didn't want to vote no, but they couldn't vote yes. So the people who actually cast votes about whether to pass this document in Congress, they all voted aye. They all voted for it, but not everybody was for it. Still, if you're trying to make a legal case, make a legal argument for your own treason, it's better to say, hey, we're all together, we're unanimous, rather than saying, most of us kind of believe this stuff. It's a stronger case to make. The second thing is this really clearly draws upon two strains of thought that were dominant in Europe and in the United States, the colonies, at this time. And they draw upon two traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Enlightenment thought. And these correspond, as we talked about in the previous discussion, with divine law and natural law. The Judeo-Christian tradition has had a long history of writing about politics. Even when we saw the quote from Martin Luther King the other day, he was quoting from a 5th century African bishop named St. Augustine and a 12th century monk named Thomas Aquinas. Right? There's 2,000 years, 1,700 years of Christians writing about politics and government. So they had a very strong concept of what that looked like. And in the 1700s, there was this new emerging resurgence of natural law thought that emerged in the Enlightenment with writers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jefferson himself. So these were thinkers who were taking governance ideas, the relationship between people and the government, from a completely secular perspective. Say, what can we do with this? So we see this with Voltaire and others. So these two streams of thought tend to run parallel with each other in this era and then get intertwined. Now, nowadays, when people talk about the document and talk about the founding period, they tend to fall in one camp or the other. So you've got strong like Christians who say, well, no, really the only thing that matters here is Judeo-Christian thought. And then you have secular people who want to get religion out of everything, and they say, no, this is really just Enlightenment thought. And both sides are wrong, right? The reality is that both of these streams of thought were intertwined in the creation of this document and were very, very influential in the political thought of the era. So, the basic principle is there are laws that are higher than the king. Where do laws higher than the king have to come from? They either come from God or they come from nature. So the laws of nature, that's natural law. And nature's God, that's divine law. They're both there. Right? And so they made specific references in the Declaration to nature's God, the creator, supreme judge of the world, and divine providence. All four of these are specific phrases that specifically mean the Christian God. Today, people might look at that and say, well, they might be talking about Allah. No, they were not talking about Allah. They could be talking about Deepak Chopra's kind of universe inside you. No, they were not. They were talking about God as described in the Bible. That's what they were doing. They knew about Islam. It did not influence their political thought at all. Okay, this was completely about the Christian approach. And when you look at the political writings and the religious writings of the day, these are all phrases that are very commonly used in that era to refer to the Christian God. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration survives to this day. We have in his handwriting his original first draft of the Constitution. Now, this is really useful for us because then we can kind of debunk some of the conspiracies and some of the mysteries about Thomas Jefferson, what he didn't believe. Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration had no religious language in it whatsoever. These phrases, nature's God, creator, supreme judge of the world, divine providence, none of that stuff was in Jefferson's draft. You know why? Because he wasn't a Christian. He was a deist. He believed in some kind of a God that kind of set the whole universe rolling like a top and then just let it go and does not ever interact, or intercede with history. So for Jefferson, the idea of an actual God who actually intervened in human affairs was stupid. He thought it was goofy. So Jefferson's draft had no religious language in it whatsoever. Where did the religious language come from? Everyone else, specifically the committee. Right? Remember those other four guys? Jefferson said, here, I got this great document. And they're like, there's no religious stuff in here. So part of this, you have to understand the audience, right? The audience is a predominantly Christian audience. The Enlightenment thought was not popular in Europe. It was only popular among intellectual elites in Europe and intellectual elites in the colonies. Everybody else was Judeo-Christian. So if you're going to make an argument to your family back in England, to your business partners back in the Netherlands, and you have nothing about God in your discussion, they are not going to buy it. Right? So the committee folded in religious concepts that matched partially their own understanding and partially the understanding about how everybody else thought at the time. So both of these traditions show up. So the Western Enlightenment thought that was important to Jefferson and to Franklin was not as important to John Adams and to Roger Sherman. Right, so you're making both of these arguments that get folded together. Questions so far? And it's important for us to recall that fundamental point, that they were making legal defense against accusations that they were traitors. because they would argue the king, he's actually the traitor. Because there are these laws that pre-exist the king. Laws ordained by God. Laws identified in nature. And the king himself is violating those laws. Why are you calling us traitors for calling him out on that? They were specifically refuting this argument that would be used in their trials for treason. The reason we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, we're going to start it today, we're going to end it up on next Tuesday, is that this is really one of the single most important documents in United States political history, and it's also considered to be one of the most important political documents in world history. So I think it's worth sitting down, and even though it seems kind of familiar to us in a general way, I really want to work through its most important parts in some detail, because I think it's critical for you to understand this in terms of understanding the minds of the authors of the Constitution and to understand why they made some of the decisions that they did and what their hopes and expectations were for the United States.